integration of immigrants and on the dynamics of openness to immigration and ethno-cultural diversity in Quebec and elsewhere. His research has been published in numerous journals, including the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, the International Migration Review, and numerous others. He's co-presenting with Jean-Philippe Gauvin, who is currently a SSHRC-funded postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science at Concordia University. And he has previously been the Skelton Clark postdoctoral fellow in Canadian Affairs in the Political Studies Department at Queen's University. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Montreal, and his main research project looks at the effects that Canadian multicultural policies have for immigrant inclusion, as well as for majority group attitudes towards diversity. Specifically, he looks at the role of immigrant language proficiency and accents in shaping both of these outcomes. And their presentation is on sounding different, but still equal. Take it away. Take it away.
Thank you so much, John. Just starting to say, I'm going to be presenting today, but Antoine is there, so be sure to ask the tough questions to him. So this is a project. Today we're going to be presenting basically the rationale behind our project, the state of our project, which is still in its infancy stages. We're still having very preliminary results, but this is a project that was funded as well by the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities. But we approach it much differently than Jenna's presentation we just saw. Specifically, we are not using such a very specific and applied approach. We are taking a large step back. And one of the questions we asked ourselves was what is resilience, right? This is the whole idea behind the network and the research we do. What's a good definition for resilience? And I truly believe that the best definition is that resilience is about the ways in which we manage to achieve outcomes despite the presence of obstacles. It's finding these ways to overcome obstacles, right? And we decided to look at these obstacles specifically, obstacles that are usually understudied, and then look at how we can manage to overcome these obstacles. But today, as I said, preliminary results, so we're going to be focusing on the obstacles themselves, and specifically sounding different. What happens when an immigrant sounds different? So we're talking about accents, we're talking about what we call audible minorities, right? Something that is akin to visible minorities, and how we can assess this discrimination. We look at cities in the sense that we look at Toronto and Montreal versus the rest of the provinces. But today I'm really going to focus on the differences between Quebec and Ontario, because as I've said, these are preliminary results. So what is the starting point? What is the, if I can just manage to switch slides here. What is the starting point? What is the context? And one of the things we thought was, one of the first things you learn when you're in business and you meet with potential partners or clients is when you shake their hands, the first impression matters. The first thing they see is what is in front of them. And this first impressions matter is very important. Why? Because people will gather information and will just shape their attitudes about people this way. And this has been known for half a century. Social psychologists have known that one of the things the human brain does is gather the relevant information, the available information, and we categorize people. This is the most important thing there. And we've documented this over decades. We know that when we look at discrimination towards immigrants, one of the most important things are ethnic cues. People gather information about immigrants and they categorize them as immigrants. So we focus a lot on what I could call visual cues. When you look at a CV on the job market and you look at a foreign sounding names, it's much harder for these individuals that have foreign sounding names to just score an interview. We know this. We know that being racialized, having a visible minority status affects how people perceive these individuals. So the majority groups sometimes will see visible minorities differently than the visible minorities will see the majority group, right? So there's this kind of asymmetry there. But what we haven't talked a lot about are these auditory cues, how people sound. There's not a lot of research on this. In the past 10 years, we've heard more about accents. We know some things. So child psychologists have found out that 5-year-olds will prefer to stay and become friends with other children in the in-group. So people from their own ethnic background, but specifically according to accents, other friends that do not have an accent. We know from research in the medical studies that doctors that have a foreign sounding accent are usually seen as less competent than people using the mainstream accent. Actually, if you receive very, very bad medical news, you actually usually prefer to have a doctor that is from the same ethnic and cultural background as you, because you trust them more. So there is something akin to accent affects the credibility of an expert. So this is basically our starting point. And so we wanted to look at both together, because as I've said, in the past 50 years, or especially last decades, most of the studies have focused on race through the use of pictures, skin tones, and a bunch of experiments that was very visual, but not a lot has been done on accents. And when it has, very, very few studies compare the role of visual cues to that of auditory cues. So this is our main question we're asking. How do visual and auditory cues interact between themselves to affect how people view immigrants? Does one trump the other? Does it mean that it's just auditory versus visual, or do they add up? Is somebody that is both an audible minority and a visible minority twice as penalized, or is he just categorized as an immigrant and they're just two parallel factors, right? These are the kinds of questions that we have not seen in the literature. So we wanted to ask them. To go back about this process of categorization, as I've said, according to social psychologists, the human brain works this way. We gather these information, visual cues, auditory cues, and this leads to categorization of a person. And this, in turn, affects our attitudes toward individuals. But is it enough? Of course not. We know that the arrow between categorization and attitudes is conditioned by something else, our missing ingredient, which is, in this case, core beliefs. When we're applying this framework to something like attitudes toward immigrants, what we actually can give as an easy example is somebody whose core beliefs about something like identity, right? What it means to be Canadian, who is a real Canadian, for instance, who is part of the in-group versus the out-group. Well, one easy example would be somebody that would have, let's say, biases towards immigrants and negative biases towards immigrants. So categorizing somebody as an immigrant, their core beliefs are negative, it's going to negatively affect their perceptions, their attitudes. But somebody else who is more inclusive, maybe he's an expat himself, will maybe categorize somebody as an immigrant, but then will relate to this more, and then maybe this will positively shape his attitudes, right? So this is kind of a process where, in this sense, we need to identify the core beliefs in order to understand how the visual and the auditory cues affect the attitudes. So this is the framework we're using. And what we decided to do was to do a survey experiment. First, we focused on experts, because I've talked about expert credibility earlier. Do ethnic cues, both visual and auditory, influence our perceptions of expert credibility? Why experts? Why not migrant workers? Why not specific cases? We ran the survey and we asked our sample to just tell us how much they would say they trust different kinds of actors. And the type of actor they would find the most credible were experts and scientists, even more so than doctors, even more so than judges. So the type of actor that is deemed the most reputable, the most credible, by the sample we used were experts, right? So this kind of confirmed our intuition that expert credibility was something to look at. And so if this is basically the best test, because if visual cues and auditory cues affect how somebody sees the type of person that is usually deemed the most credible, then this has important consequences and important implications for other types of experts, for politicians, for workers, for all categories of people, right? But I've talked about core beliefs. What are core beliefs? When we speak of discrimination, when we speak of migrant inclusion, I think the core beliefs relate to the conception of the boundaries of identity. As I've said, what does it take to be considered Canadian? Some people have a very exclusive, rigid conception of the boundaries, right? You need to be born in Canada. Other people have a very flexible and very porous idea of their boundaries. Anybody can be Canadian if they want to, right? But most importantly, the conception of identity could behave differently in Ontario and Quebec, because in Quebec, the most sensitive topic about identity relates to language, right? And we're studying accents here. So it's not just about race. We have the same debates about systemic racism. We're not going to go into current events and laws and so on, but one of the things that typically in Quebec is very salient for identity is this dimension of language. So maybe how identity is conceived in both provinces will behave differently on how we find experts to be credible or not. What did we do? So we ran a survey. We ran a survey on 2,200 respondents. The condition to be, the requirements to be a respondent in the survey was to be white, born in Canada, and if in Ontario, English, or if in Quebec, having French as the first language, right? So this was basically, we were targeting what we call the majority group in both provinces. We split the sample somewhat evenly, but at least proportionally to the population between the metro area and the rest of the province. So 40% came from the Greater Toronto area, and in Quebec, 40% came from Greater Montreal. So then in the future, we can actually compare how these behave differently between cities. But as I've said, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus more on Quebec versus Ontario. We ran an experiment. So we had an expert come in and explain and run an interview, participate in an interview about climate change. Why climate change? Because we didn't want to be so transparent and focus on something like immigration. We wanted to, I won't say mislead, but we wanted to basically just go around and make sure that people knew, they didn't have any idea that this was an experiment. So they were targeted as people that would grade and assess the credibility of a climate change expert. Also climate change, because carbon tax is one of the most divisive issue in the country. We know from previous research that it's almost evenly split 50-50, both in Ontario and Quebec in terms of support towards a carbon tax. So we drafted something about that. And we had the expert vary in terms of his accent and the color of his skin. We studied a bunch of dependent variables. We had several tests. For the purposes of the presentation today, I'm going to focus on expert credibility alone. And this was the narrative we carefully crafted. I won't read all of this. I won't go through it all, but just know that the expert presented himself with a clear opinion that to meet Canada's climate target goals was simple: to increase taxes on carbon-based fuel. So he was in favor of a carbon tax. Then we added a bunch of information, factual information about the number of megatons that the energy sector is producing each year. Then, as you see, the World Bank, the OECD. So we put more credibility in the fact that this was not the expert's message, but the international bodies are actually going in and supporting this argument as well. So this was the core of the text. But what is most important is that the respondents themselves would fall into one of four groups. Basically, when they arrived at one point in the survey, they would hear this text given by one expert. But they didn't know that there was, three other groups. So either they saw the vignette on the left with the white male expert and heard the mainstream Canadian accent, or they saw the same vignette, but they heard this text read in an Armenian accent. On the other way, so another group would have instead the racialized expert, the Black expert, and would have the same mainstream accent used to read the text. Or they would have a Togolese accent. So what we did is basically we hired voice actors in Montreal that worked both in Montreal and Toronto, and they were voice actors that were selected. So we didn't ask for a specific accent. We just screened dozens of actors, and we asked them to provide the accent that they were most familiar with. And in the end, we ended up with voice actors that actually provided their own accent from their own specific cultural background. One actor read the text and said, basically, you just heard my father is what you heard, right? So we wanted something that was truthful and the most credible. And so this is what the respondents heard. But now, how did having one group, one accent, and one vignette over the other change the ways in which these respondents found the expert to be credible? Well, it did matter a lot, in fact. When you look at the two bars on the left, so the higher the bar, the most credible they were assessed. So it's a scale from 0 to 10. So you see on the left, you have scores above the 7 point. And on the right, the two other bars are those two groups that had the foreign accented expert, right? The first thing you can see from these preliminary results is that on average, accent matters a lot. So the two bars on the left, the mainstream accent was deemed more credible than the person that used a foreign accent. It's the same text. It's exactly the same thing, right? And more importantly, the mainstream accent was the same. It's the same actor, it was the same recording, right? Between the mainstream accent for the one vignette over the other. What's interesting is that when you compare the white expert to the racialized expert, it kind of goes contrary to our expectations that you see the racialized expert as seemingly more, in both cases, more credible. But statistically, this difference is not statistically significant. The confidence interval overlap. I said earlier, most important in the process are the core beliefs. So we developed a measure that is widely used in the realm of racial attitudes, which is the conception of the boundaries of identity. And we use the dimension of ascriptive identity, which basically means it's being from very inclusive to very exclusive, or having a very rigid idea. For instance, somebody who is completely very exclusive, completely ascriptive, would think that only those born in Canada are real Canadians. Otherwise, somebody who's very inclusive would be anybody who wants can be Canadian, right? And so these are the two distributions. This is the averages for the two groups, being the group of Ontario and Quebec respondents. So, 1,200 people each. What we find that is interesting is that in both cases, it's heavily skewed towards being very inclusive. So the majority of our sample was very inclusive, especially in Quebec. So if you see just over on the left-hand side, so the most of the area under the line falls under the very inclusiveness. But and it was somewhat more spread out in the Ontarian sample, but still very skewed toward being inclusive. So this needs to be taken into account in statistical models, and this is what we did. And basically, this is looking at expert credibility. So instead of having 4 bars, we're having 4 lines, and these are spread out, ventilated over this ascriptive conception. So going from being very inclusive to very exclusive. So focusing on the left, just looking at those respondents that are very inclusive, we would expect them to rate the different experts, the blue dot being the Black expert with no accent or with a mainstream accent, and secondly, the red dot being the racialized expert with a foreign accent. You see that being very inclusive, the racialized expert, accent and no accent, is rated the most credible. When you look only at those that are very exclusive, that have a very rigid idea of identity, It's the opposite. It's actually the Black expert with a foreign sounding accent that is the most penalized, right? So accent matters and race matters in this case.
2-minute warning.
Okay, 2 slides and I'm done. So when you're looking at Quebec versus Ontario, does this process work in the same way in both provinces? Not at all. And this is the most interesting for us. When you look in Ontario, just as very inclusive, so the Black expert with a foreign sounding accent, when you're looking at the very exclusive, it's clearly the group that is the most penalized. When you're looking at Quebec, it's not the same thing. The orange line actually refers to the white expert with an accent. So again, the idea of being a very exclusive or rigid idea of the conception of identity in one way is manifested toward penalizing the Black expert with a foreign accent, and in Quebec towards the white expert with a foreign accent. So again, maybe it's more about language, maybe it's about being subversive, because the visual cue makes you believe the person is in the in-group, but hearing him is something different. We're not so sure about this yet, but this is one of the questions we have. So in conclusion, well, definitely accents affect perceptions of credibility. Visual cues do as well, but this is conditioned both by the conception of identity and by region, because in in Ontario, we saw that racialized experts with a foreign accent were the most penalized, but in Quebec, yet again, a province where the most sensitive issue related to identity is language, it wasn't so much about race as having a white expert with a foreign sounding accent. So this was very interesting to us. And finally, it just spreads the question it spurs the question of how does this fit with our understanding of multiculturalism? We like to say that in Canada, being Canadian means being different. It's our differences that make us Canadian. Everybody can be whoever we want, but we definitely see we have a whole debate in this country about systemic racism. We can see from what we saw in the framework and the way that our brains work that clearly we're doing systemic profiling even when we're looking at experts. So it has implications for public health experts, for politicians, for job applicants. It has implication for very much. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, and thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really